An interesting trend has been emerging in several science fiction franchises. It's hardly a recent one, but nonetheless I think it makes for an interesting conversation point, and that is the notion of transmedia storytelling and the usage of a franchise's wider universe to create its own take on previously established works. Hi, Rick here, and this video is a bit different from my usual lore segments, but I thought I'd take a look at some of the pros and cons of this sort of franchise borrowing from its own transmedia sources. Is it a good thing? Generally, I enjoy it when a series decides to create spin-off stories to add lore and flesh out its world building, but the canonicity of these tales towards the franchise in question often differs depending on the license. Let's look at 4 examples: Star Trek, Star Wars, Mass Effect and Doctor Who. There will be plot spoilers for all 4 by necessity. Star Trek has always held to the approach that what appears on screen is in continuity and the rest of the narratives are official but not part of canon. The fandom often divides these into Memory Alpha and Memory Beta to differentiate. In the not too distant past, when Disney acquired the Star Wars titles, they drew a hard line between canon and legends, a similar division to Trek initially, but with a selected few works across multiple media formats that are treated as occurrences within the canon chronology. Mass Effect has treated its spin-off books and comics as part of the greater narrative from the start, with later games even including characters such as Kaylee Sanders, who got her start in the prequel Mass Effect book Revelation, and the story of one of Mass Effect 3's DLCs being a conclusion to events set in motion in comics. And finally, there is Doctor Who, which basically doesn't really care about its continuity. Built into the show's DNA is the notion of copious amounts of time travel, so they have a get-out clause to rewrite whatever they want, and add that to the fact that the Doctor herself often forgets things and lies for plot convenience, and you generally have a show where they prioritise telling stories over any internal consistency. 4 different science fiction franchises and 4 different approaches to their official spin-off media. So let's look at the pros and cons of each approach, shall we? Star Trek's Alpha-Beta divide is rife with discrepancies and inconsistencies, and there exist numerous works of beta canon that cannot have occurred in order for certain shows to have taken place. Often, spin-off media in Star Trek will attempt to fix as many plot holes as it creates, but the reason for this line in the sand becomes apparent the more of these stories you explore. Personally, I have held the approach that a novel, comic or game can be considered a sort of soft canon, in that it's true until disproven by the shows, which always take precedent. I do this because there are numerous tales out there across a multitude of formats that all have something going for them, and it would be a shame to strike them from the record, as it were, just because they're not canon. And clearly the writers of modern Star Trek think so too. In both Star Trek Discovery and Star Trek Picard, we've seen them take elements from their expanded media and fold them into the primary canon, aka the shows. The notion of the Romulan Tal Shiar getting their hands on Borg tech, as well as the fractured state of their collapsed empire, is the same sort of background set dressing created for Star Trek Online, a video game which, if you're a frequenter of my channel, you probably know all too well. In Star Trek Discovery's 2nd season, their main antagonist was a rogue Starfleet Section 31 AI called Control. Section 31 is sort of a Starfleet Black Ops division, but the origin of this Control was from Star Trek licensed works by the same name about that S-31 division of Starfleet and their AI taking matters into its own hands. There were several changes, the time period and the depiction of Control itself chief among them, but the core idea was there. So the pros of this split between canon and not materials allow for a myriad of ideas to be created and explored in sort of removed universes that reflect the canon Star Trek timeline but aren't beholden to the laws and lore of its continuity. Then, if the writers of the shows like a particular idea, they can pluck those elements out and sprinkle them into the canon. We see the same thing in Star Wars. The most notable example to my mind is the inclusion of Grand Admiral Thrawn. Originally a character from the Dark Air books and graphic novels set after the events of Return of the Jedi, the popular character was added to the show Star Wars Rebels, a canon show whose elements have surfaced even in films of the franchise. So here we see another approach. In the same way as Star Trek, we see that many older works of Star Wars are relegated to Legends material equatable to memory beta. They are a hectic mix of soft canon stories that simply can no longer have occurred. But Disney Star Wars goes one step further and has selected materials across a number of media that it bestows the stamp of continuity to moving forwards. And this does include games such as Jedi Fallen Order and the campaign of Battlefront 2, as well as several series of comics and numerous books. Not to mention the aforementioned Star Wars Rebels, Resistance, The Mandalorian and the Clone Wars. But this creates a new problem. Many of these spin-offs, in whatever form, while frequently rather good, have a much smaller audience than the core films, but being canon, are to have definitively occurred in the same timeline. Therefore, when these elements do crop up within the films, audiences unfamiliar with the expanded universes are often left in the dark. This varies by the method of inclusion from, oh, I just didn't see that, like spotting the ghost from Star Wars Rebels in Rogue One and Rise of Skywalker, to WTF, that guy's still alive? Like Maul's reveal in Solo: A Star Wars Story. This is where the argument, I shouldn't have to research X to understand Y, comes from. Understandably, a show, or film in this example, should have just made it clear on its own if something was going to be relevant and made the time to explain it. The worst outcome of this approach is leaving the audience confused and frustrated, while the strength is that those who have followed such media feel rewarded for their efforts. Also, from a business standpoint, it encourages people to pay more attention to these spin-off stories, especially if they are labelled as canon. The final point I'm going to raise on the Star Wars front is Rise of Skywalker. This film was, in my opinion, not great, not awful, but definitely not the climactic culmination that had been promised. However, having read the Dark Empire comics as a kid, I applied my knowledge of those comics to the films, specifically with regards as to how Palpatine survived Darth Vader's betrayal. I assumed that we were looking at a clone body of the Emperor housing his spirit, and the reason for its decayed state was that it could not contain Palpatine's power. This is why he needed a strong force-sensitive vessel like Rey. None of this was made clear in the films, aside from vague insinuation that Snoke may have been a clone of some sorts, but then the novelisation launches and I see Star Wars Theories video on the reveal stating that the novel included an explanation of Palpatine's survival and lo and behold, clone body. This highlights another two issues with such multimedia storytelling. One, if you borrow from an older source, you need to retell it. Where Admiral Thrawn was an example of how to do this right, this is an example of how not to do it. There are a lot of people out there unfamiliar with the plot of the Dark Empire Legends stories. This then creates a further divide between people who fill in the blanks with their own Legends-fueled canon and those who just go, what is this? A couple of extra lines of exposition could have prevented that from ever being an issue anyway, which draws me to the second point. The novelisation of Rise of Skywalker includes extra content not seen in the films that explains away a lot of plot holes, so which takes precedent. If the books are to be believed, then there are far fewer issues with the film, which is good, right? But not really, because that's not how it works, because those issues are in the film, with no explanation, and therefore they are plot holes, the suggestion of sloppy storytelling, even if these extra bits were meant to always be in the film and were cut. Mass Effect is probably the only one on this list that doesn't suffer too badly at the hands of telling its universe's tales across multiple fronts. The comics are fairly self-contained, and while several of the books contain events that are referenced in the main games, such as the Cerberus attack on the Migrant Fleet, the game does a good job of filling in the blanks with dialogue and an in-game codex where you can brush up on your lore. Do we need to know how Shepard was recovered between Mass Effect 1 and 2? No, but the game tells us that Liara did it and brought Shepard to Cerberus to be rebuilt. If you want to know more, you can read the comics about this instance. Good. You've delivered the relevant information and piqued my interest, but I don't feel like I'm missing a piece. Finally, Doctor Who, which in many ways is far easier and more excusable because of its blasé approach to continuity. In the Doctor Who 50th anniversary events, there was a short episode called Night of the Doctor uploaded to the internet that depicted the regeneration of Doctor 8, played by Paul McGann, to John Hurt's War Doctor. Not only was this arguably a Transmedia story in and of itself, although this was aired on TV too, it most definitely was in continuity with the shows of the time and even included the Doctor giving affirmation of his numerous companions. These companions, however, were only ever heard from in the audiobook series that rose in Doctor Who's hiatus, never appearing in the shows. If Night of the Doctor is canon, then so too are the names of 8's companions and possibly the entire audiobook library featuring them. In my opinion, this is actually a good balance of how to portray such multimedia continuity short of retelling entire narratives. We get a soft affirmation that these tales happened, but the people who have not listened to them don't feel like they've missed a trick because they weren't a focus of that episode. On top of this, the Night of the Doctor short itself serves as a prequel to Day of the Doctor, but isn't required viewing as all the relevant details concerning the War Doctor are presented in that anniversary special. This isn't even touching on the fact that some of the best TV stories were based on media from beyond the screen. Although Doctor Who is not without gripe. There is, of course, the Cartel Master Plan, an unused backstory for the Doctor that was to explain how he was in fact a genetic reincarnation of a very important figure in Time Lord history, the Other. This never came to be in the shows, but over time elements of this unused backstory cropped into other media around Doctor Who, such as the Lung Barrow novel. On top of this, the notion of the Doctor being instrumental in the Time Lord's founding was eventually reused in Series 12 of the revival, with the Doctor apparently being the Timeless Child, the origin of regeneration, and much like the cartel-planned Doctor, was unaware of her lineage. Of course, there are a couple of change-ups and the abandonment of certain elements, but again, the core idea is reused. For the most part, I enjoy other mediums to consume my favourite franchises. Sometimes I want to read a book or play a game, not stare passively at a screen, and the added lore and stories I get from these are often enlightening and entertaining. However, like too much water, being poured into a vat and spilling over to be captured in buckets, these books, comics, games and novelisations can serve to bolster and expand a narrative's content beyond its original means. The problem arises when the contents of that vat aren't enough and those extra buckets stop being extra and become necessary. Then again, on the counter side, people don't like being told that their time and investment put into anything was all for nothing, so hand-waving away entire swaths of extra content because it's not canon is going to make people less interested in those other sources and experience fewer of them. Also, the trend of franchises dipping into their own expanded lore for ideas is an odd one, and on one hand I think it's brilliant to see these stories being folded onto continuity and therefore on display to a larger audience. But on the other hand, does it detract from those original stories? Are people going to read the original Thrawn books now they have the new canon ones to go to? In the same way, I don't want these stories to become required reading for a show. I don't want them to become irrelevant. Personally, I don't like it when the primary medium cannot portray the entirety of its relevant details, and these end up in spin-off adaptations or other works. But equally, those other works need to have value to the whole, beyond just being a disposable story that never really happened. What do you think? Is there a definitive middle ground and rule set that could curate extra content? Something like Disney's canon stories approach, or do you prefer the Trek notion of do what you like, it doesn't matter? How about the notion of borrowing from their own elements for retelling? Is it lazy? Would you rather see an extra-canonical story told ad verbatim on screen, or is merely seeing a reference enough? I'm predicting varied responses here, because fans of one character that only ever cropped up in books, for example, would no doubt love to see them in canon, while others probably couldn't give a fig of a character's origin as long as it's explained properly. Others may just want their continuities clearly defined, and never the two shall meet. And there are merits and cons to every approach, as I hope I've illustrated. Thank you for taking the time to watch this one, and I hope to hear some interesting opinions amid the inevitable angry rants. Thank you again, I've been Rick, and until next time, goodbye.